The coffin was meant to silence her forever. Instead, when the vault was pried open centuries later, it exhaled. A heavy sweetness, cloying, rotten, unmistakable, filled the dark chamber. This was the breath of Queen Elizabeth I, leaking through warped lead and splintered wood. She had been Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, mistress of oceans and empires. Her very name had been forged into legend. Yet the coffin betrayed what the portraits never showed: swollen flesh, collapsing velvet, a tomb that reeked of death. To open Elizabeth's resting place is not just to touch history. It is to confront a queen who spent her life fleeing mortality only to lose her battle with rot. Her grave became her final rebellion and her final humiliation. Elizabeth Tudor was raised in a world where death was not a stranger, but a shadow. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded before Elizabeth's 3rd birthday. Her father, Henry VIII, destroyed wives and courtiers alike. Her half-sister, Mary V, burned Protestants at the stake until the streets of London smelled of charred flesh. Elizabeth grew up knowing a crown was always balanced on a knife's edge. As queen, she lived with daggers in the dark. Catholic assassins plotted her murder. Spanish ships threatened her shores. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, schemed for her throne until Elizabeth signed her death warrant, a signature that burned her conscience until her last breath. But of all terrors, one lingered closest: the fate of her own body. She knew the surgeon's knives, the ritual of Tudor embalming. The belly slid open, the organs scooped out, the cavity stuffed with spices, not to honor the dead, but to choke back the stink of their rot. She had heard of coffins bursting in church vaults, spilling the corruption of kings. For a queen obsessed with dignity, it was a nightmare that gnawed at her throne more cruelly than any Spanish armada. When she whispered her final pleas, "Do not cut me. Do not hollow me, let me meet God whole," she must have known it would be ignored. Death is the one authority even monarchs cannot command. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth died, and her surgeons sharpened their knives. The Queen was dead. March 24, 1603, ended not just the life of Elizabeth Tudor, but the dynasty of the Tudors themselves. In the hours after her death, her court was paralyzed with silence. For 44 years, she had been England's anchor in storms. Now her body lay cooling, the flesh sagging, the royal mask beginning to give way. Her closest attendants, who had watched her defy enemies, feared a different collapse. Her corpse. There could be no hesitation. If her remains were not prepared, decomposition would race ahead, turning the Queen's farewell into a spectacle of horror. The embalming chamber was ready. It was not a place of reverence, but of butchery cloaked in ritual. A stone table stood in the center, cold and merciless. Long knives and hooks lay in gleaming rows. Bowls of spices waited: myrrh, cinnamon, cloves, rosemary, each chosen not for tenderness, but for their ability to smother the reek of human ruin. Her body was stripped. The crimson pallor of her cheeks, once painted with lead and ceruse to mimic eternal youth, was gone. In its place, a gray slackness spread. The surgeons bent over her, and the first incision tore across the chest of Gloriana. Flesh gave way to steel. The heart that had borne a kingdom was lifted out. The liver, the lungs, the intestines, all removed and discarded. What had once been the inner machinery of majesty was reduced to refuse. The hollow shell was packed tight with herbs, their sharp scent rising in clouds above the body. Yet even then the embalmers knew their efforts were fragile. Perfume could not halt rot. It could only buy time. Finally, the body was swathed in crimson velvet, embroidered with Tudor roses, symbols of a dynasty now extinguished. The surgeons sealed her into a lead-lined coffin, heavy as a tomb of stone, designed to hold her gases in check and prevent the catastrophic bursting that had humiliated other royal corpses. But lead was no miracle. It bent, it warped, it sweated. It could hold back the stench of death for a season, perhaps a century, but never forever. Elizabeth's coffin was a time bomb of silence. The funeral that followed was glorious. A barge carried her coffin down the Thames, the river waters black with mourning. Thousands lined the banks to see their queen pass one last time. The bells of London tolled, and the abbey prepared to welcome the last Tudor into its vaults. The coffin itself, though, betrayed uneasy whispers. Attendants closest to it spoke of a strange odor, sweet, cloying, corrupt, that slipped past the lid. They tried to cover it with flowers, with incense, with the solemn dignity of ritual. But death was speaking through the cracks. Elizabeth was lowered into her vault beneath Westminster Abbey, her body encased in velvet, sealed in lead, entombed in stone. The lid was shut, the prayers recited, the Queen surrendered to eternity. Above her grave, the nation moved on. A new monarch, James I, claimed the throne. The Virgin Queen became memory, portrait, myth, but her coffin did not sleep. Inside, the spices lost their strength. The velvet rotted, turning from regal crimson to a damp blackness clinging to her skin. The gases of decomposition swelled her body, pressing outward, straining against the lead like a drumbeat in the dark. Slowly, year by year, the coffin bent. The wood collapsed into dust. The lid bulged, warping like a bloated belly. Whispers of the stench remained, carried in the stones of the abbey. Mourners who lingered near the vault sometimes noted the air was heavy there, thick and strange, though they dared not speak too loudly. No one wished to admit that England's greatest monarch was rotting badly beneath their feet. 2 centuries passed. The world above changed. Kings and queens rose and fell. Empires expanded, revolutions thundered, industrial machines replaced horse and plough. Yet under the stones of Westminster, Elizabeth's coffin sagged silently into ruin. By the 19th century, curiosity had become stronger than reverence. The Victorians, obsessed with the dead, could not resist the temptation to pry open the secrets of the Abbey's vaults. And so, lanterns in hand, Dean Arthur Stanley and his companions descended into the dark corridors of royal tombs. They moved among silence and dust. The walls breathed with centuries of decay. When they reached the chamber of Elizabeth Tudor, they found not majesty, but collapse. The coffin that had once gleamed with velvet and lead was crumbling. The wood was gone. The velvet was little more than powder, stained and brittle. The lid had bent grotesquely, sagging like old flesh. The initials E.R., Elizabeth Regina, still clung faintly to the lid, but it was a ghostly mark, nearly erased by corrosion. The air was dense, suffocating, tainted with the musk of centuries. Elizabeth, embalmed against her will, embalmed to preserve dignity, had instead become a spectacle of defeat, and above her, stacked in the same vault, lay the coffin of her half-sister. Mary I, enemies in life, rivals in blood, locked together in death. Their rivalry had once split England with fire and executions. Now their rotting coffins pressed against each other in a silence that no sermon could reconcile. Elizabeth's corpse had not exploded as some feared, but it had leaked. The coffin was bloated, the velvet stained. The scent of her final decay lingered in the air, even centuries after her burial. She had wanted to meet God whole, untouched, unbroken. Instead, her body was hollowed, stuffed, wrapped, sealed, and still betrayed by rot in the half-light of lanterns. The Victorians saw what Elizabeth herself had feared most, that even a queen could not master corruption. Beneath the polished marble of Westminster Abbey, tourists drift and whisper, eyes lifted to stained glass windows glowing with holy fire. They do not think of what lies underfoot. They do not imagine the sagging coffins, the warped lead, the swollen silence of England's royal dead. To walk those aisles is to tread unknowingly on a graveyard of kings and queens, Elizabeth thought. I rests there still, if resting is the word. Her coffin, once wrapped in velvet and lead, has long since failed. The wood is gone, the velvet decayed, the lead warped into grotesque bulges. Within lies not a queen but the remnants of one, bones, scraps of cloth, fragments of hair, all softened and tainted by centuries of moisture and gas. Her Majesty has been reduced to dust laced with perfume, the faint echo of cloves and myrrh that could not keep corruption at bay. This is the truth she feared, the truth she begged her physicians to spare her from. Do not cut me. Do not hollow me. Let me meet my Maker whole. Those were her whispered wishes, yet they were ignored, and so death humiliated her body. Surgeons carved out her organs. Embalmers stuffed her like a vessel. Velvet was wrapped around her ruined flesh, a costume for a corpse. She was sealed in lead, not for eternity, but for containment. She was never preserved, only delayed. Centuries later, the coffin stank. Even through metal and stone, the odor of decay escaped. Elizabeth, who once perfumed herself with roses and musks, greeted her mourners with the sweetness of rot. The virgin queen who had ruled empires was reduced to the oldest, lowest truth of all. Flesh rots, bones crumble, lead bends, velvet fades, and yet she endures. Not in her coffin, not in the collapsed wreckage that horrified Dean Stanley in the 1800s, but in legend, in the myth of Gloriana, in the Armada defeated, in the golden age of poets and explorers. While her body failed, her story triumphed. She had feared corruption, but her memory slipped beyond its reach. Still, there is an irony no historian can escape. Elizabeth, who sought eternal dignity, lies pressed against the coffin of her sister, Mary that. In life, Mary had burned Protestants. In the streets of London, Elizabeth had turned the nation Protestant again with fire in her own eyes. Their rivalry was carved in blood and fear, yet in death they share the same vault, their warped coffins leaning into each other like reluctant companions, enemies buried as neighbors, queens who would not yield in life, forced to yield in silence. The abbey above them hums with hymns, weddings, coronations. Beneath, the air is thick with the scent of centuries, the musk of dust and lead and stone. Time has erased the perfumes, the jewels, the rituals, leaving only this: silence, dust, and the faint, stubborn smell of corruption. Elizabeth once believed she had conquered time. She had outwitted enemies, outlasted assassins, survived rebellions, buried rivals. But time is the one monarch even a queen cannot defy. Her coffin tells the story her portraits hide. No crown outshines the grave. It is easy to imagine Dean Stanley, lantern in hand, standing before that bloated, collapsed coffin in the 19th century. The initials ER glimmered faintly, a ghostly whisper of Elizabeth Regina. Yet nothing regal remained. Only warped lead, stained cloth, and the stench of inevitability. For all the velvet, all the ceremony, all the terror of her surgeon's knives, Elizabeth had ended like every subject she once ruled. And so, the stinking coffin of Queen Elizabeth of Versailles becomes more than a relic. It is a sermon carved not in stone but in decay. A warning that legacy belongs to memory, not flesh. That velvet rots, that lead bends, that perfume sour, that even queens must feed the hunger of the earth. Above her, visitors shuffle through the abbey, pointing at monuments, listening to choirs. They imagine majesty, glory, sanctity. They do not smell what Stanley smelled. They do not know what leaked through that coffin. They see Elizabeth as portrait and pageant. But below, her body tells the darker truth. She was human, and perhaps that is why her coffin still fascinates us. Because it makes Elizabeth real again. Not just the virgin queen, the Armada's conqueror, the golden monarch of Shakespeare's England, but a woman who aged, who feared, who begged for mercy in her last hours, and who rotted like all mortals do. Gloriana's stinking coffin is not the ruin of her legend. It is its shadow, and shadows make light brighter.